Thank you for joining me for this study in the Lifeway study of 1st and 2nd Kings. It's session 11. Our text is 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 7 through 20. The title is God Judges, and the lesson summary statement is God holds all people accountable for their sins. I'm going to use the example that is given in goexplorethebible.com as my introduction, in which it talks about a Gallup poll that reveals that half of Americans believe the moral values of the United States are poor, while another 37% judge the nation's values as only fair. And there's a paragraph there that gives a summary of that poll. And then it has these questions. Why do you think Americans are so pessimistic about the country's moral conditions, and what happens to a nation when its morals decline over time? It also suggests that you put on the board two columns that you believe it's declining, that you believe it's improving, and then as the class comes to that morning, they just simply go to the board and they make their vote known, and then you compare it to the Gallup poll. I thought that would be a good way to move into the subject of the lesson. And then I want to concentrate just a moment on the lesson summary statement. And I'm going to ask the class if they would join me in a meditation, group meditation on the lesson summary statement. For example, one of the ways that I'm going to do this is just emphasize certain words and ask them what are the lessons that we can draw from that. For example, if you take the word holds, God holds all people accountable for their sins, and you emphasize the word holds. God holds all people accountable for their sins. What is being stressed when we look at that statement and we're talking about God holding people accountable? Well, the idea that I'm driving at is you own it. It's yours. It's not somebody else's. It's your sin that you're going to be held accountable for. I've said before in our church that on Judgment Day, when someone begins to blame someone else or blame something else for their behavior, I believe God will interrupt them and say, we don't play that game here. You did it, you acted, you related, this is your sin. God holds all people. You own it. It's your responsibility. Or the word all. God holds all people accountable for their sins. Moral people, immoral people. Old people, young people. Religious people, non-religious people. There is no one that is not going to give an account of their life before the living and holy God. How about the word there? God holds all people accountable for their sins. Again, that's getting at the idea of owning it. It's not what someone's done to you. It's not what circumstances have happened to you. It is your decisions and your will and your choices that you will be answering for. So this is a very powerful statement. God holds all people accountable for their sins. Then I want to give some background. The text, 2 Kings chapter 17, it presents a political reason for the fall of Assyria, for Israel, and it presents a theological reason for the fall of Israel. First of all, in the political reason, in the chapters preceding it, there's a man named Tiglath-Pileser. And he is the king of Assyria, and he is in the mood to conquer the nations around him. And he is successful in expanding his kingdom, and some of that includes the nation of Israel. When Tiglath-Pileser dies, then Shalmaneser II comes to the throne. And Shalmaneser continues Tiglath's expansion, and he goes into Israel. Now, what happened is there were two Israelite kings, a king named Pekah, and he is assassinated by Hoshea. And Hoshea rules for 9 years. When Tiglath dies and Shalmaneser II, his son, takes over, there's this interim period, and a lot of times the vassal states will think that the kingdom is in a weakened position, and so they'll stop paying tribute and stop being submissive. And that's what happens. And so Shalmaneser comes against the northern kingdom of Israel, whose king at that time is Hoshea. And they set up camp around the city of Samaria for 3 years, sometime in the year 722 BC, when the Israel northern kingdom falls. Shalmaneser II dies, and Shalmaneser V dies, Sargon II takes over, and he finishes the job, and Israel is wiped off the map. What Assyria would do many times, not all of the time, but in order to keep people rising against them in opposition, they would take an entire population from their nation, and then they would just scatter them among the other nations. And that kept them from coming together and organizing an opposition to Assyria. And that's what the Assyrians do with Israel. It was brutal and vicious in their actions. And so we see here the decline and the destruction of the nation of Israel. Now that's the theological reasons that are played out in the previous chapters and in the first 6 verses of 1 Kings chapter 17. But there were also theological reasons that are given, and that's what our text is about. Our text is not concentrating on the political reasons, it's concentrating on the theological reasons. And the reason why the nation is destroyed and is scattered to the other nations is they have spurned the one true God who rescued them. They did what the nations did before them, whom God drove out of the land. They followed the same practices, and even though God sent wave after wave of prophet, they would not listen. And after decades and decades of witnesses by the prophets, they wouldn't listen, and then God brings judgment upon them. And so that's the reason that's given as to why the nation of Israel is destroyed. And remember, he's speaking to an audience that is in exile, and he's explaining to them, this is why you're in exile, because you disobeyed the God and judgment has come upon you. But he's also providing this word of hope that God is going to save a remnant, and from that remnant will come the anointed one, the Messiah. So there's hope for them as well. So the first point of our lesson is warned, chapter 17, verse 7 through 13. 2 times in this text, it mentions that the Lord has driven the people out of the land of Israel. And 2 times it mentions that he has driven people out of the land before Israel. It's in verse 8 and it's in verse 11. Before I read the text, I'm going to ask the men of the class if they would identify the actions of Israel in rejecting God. What did they do, the nation of Israel, to reject God? And then I'm going to ask the women, what was the evidence of God's direction? What did he do to say to the people, hear me and obey me? So I would read through the text, and then as they respond, that gives me an opportunity to make some explanations about what's happening in this text. Verse 7, this disaster happened because the people of Israel sinned against the Lord their God, who brought them out of the land of Egypt from the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, because they worshipped other gods. So it tells us right here at the very beginning, this is why it happened. They had sinned against God. There were many horrible things that these people had done in terms of child sacrifice, in terms of their perverted worship. But the fundamental reason for the judgment of God upon these people is they had sinned against God. In fact, the reason for the things that are going to follow that he outlines, this is what they have done. The reason those things happened is because they had sinned against God. They didn't worship the one true God. And worship of the one true God and the way we relate to people are tied together. Anytime a nation steps away from serving and worshiping the one true God, one of the evidences of that is the way they treat people and the way they relate to one another. And so what he is saying here is what's happened to this nation, and the reason for the destruction is their sin, their disbelief of God. he goes on to say that he begins to list the things that he had done for them. This is the same God that brought them out of Egypt. And yet, amazingly, they don't worship that God. They worship other gods. In fact, he's going to point out they worship the gods, the so-called gods that were in the land that he drove the nations out who worshiped those gods. It's irrational what they've done. Verse 8, they lived according to the customs of the nations that the Lord had dispossessed before the Israelites, and according to what the kings of Israel did. See, they're following the same practices and lifestyle of the very people that God drove out of the land because they were worshiping the false gods. Verse 9, the Israelites secretly did these things against the Lord their God that were not right. The word secret there, this is the only time this word is used in the Bible, and it probably has the idea of concealed, or that is the idea of private. They thought their worship was hidden from outside pressures, and they could worship as they really chose to worship. But, of course, God saw that worship. They built high places in all their towns, from watchtower to fortified city. In other words, what he's saying is, in the smallest and most desolate places to the heavily populated places, they filled the nation with these idols. You couldn't go anywhere in Israel that you couldn't find these idols that the people were worshiping. Now, I have heard that if you drive across the state of Indiana, that whether you're in a large city area or whether you're in a rural area, you're going to see basketball goals. And if that's true, what does that tell you about the state of Indiana? And of course, what I'm looking for is they're fervent about basketball in the state of Indiana. In Oklahoma and Texas, it's football. You go and you'll see football everywhere in this state. And what he's talking about, this picture of, it's in watchtowers, it's in fortified cities. The point is these people were fervent in their worship of these false idols. Verse 10 says they set up for themselves sacred pillars and Asherah poles on every high hill and under every green tree. They burned incense there on all the high places, just like the nations that the Lord had driven out before him. They actually performed the same acts of worship to these false gods that the Canaanite nations had done. They did evil things, angering the Lord. They did things, when it says it angered the Lord, it's the idea of they provoked the Lord, and this is something that God is not going to tolerate. Verse 12, they served idols. All the Lord had told them, you must not do this. Verse 13, still the Lord warned Israel and Judah through every prophet and every seer. You see, what he's saying is, even though they did this, in God's grace and mercy, what he did was he continued to send a warning to them. He wanted them to understand that they were doing wrong. And the word warning is a legal document. It's almost like he's reading a contract that they've made with him. And they have agreed to live for him, and they're breaking contract with him. And it says he did it through every prophet and every seer. The prophets were those who gave the message of God. And generally they would give them to a larger crowd. The seers tended to be those who spoke to a smaller audience, and they interpreted the signs that were happening as an evidence of God at work in the people. But the point that's being stated is they had been sufficiently warned. They knew that what they were doing was wrong. And here's what he says to them: turn from your evil ways and keep my commands and statutes according to the whole law I commanded your ancestors and sent to you through my servants, the prophets. The commands are the words that are more general in covenant keeping. It's things like, I'm holy, therefore you be holy. The statutes literally means things that are inscribed. And it would be things like the Ten Commandments or those covenant stipulations that are spelled out for us in Exodus and Leviticus and Deuteronomy. God gave them clear commands of what His will was and what it looked like to violate that. And He's saying that I commanded your ancestors and sent you through my servants, the prophets. You're not the first generation to do this. There's a lifestyle that's happening with you. And what He calls for is genuine repentance. They are to turn. They're to acknowledge their sin. They are to make a conscious effort to change their lives and their lifestyles. And He says they are to keep His commands. And there's two shades to that word keep. It means you're to do my commands. And it also has about it the idea of preserving for the future. So the emphasis of this idea is I want you to change your life. I want you to make a conscious effort to do that. I want you to do what's right. And I want you to understand that this is for the preservation of the generations. This is not just for your benefit. Well, we go through that, and your studies of these texts will give you an opportunity to explain those kinds of things that you engage with the text. And then you'll ask for the men to give their input on identifying the actions Israel rejects, and then the women, what was the evidence of God's direction, and you can have an opportunity to add to their understanding and continue that dialogue. So today, what are the present day idols and high places of our day? What are modern examples of the same kinds of sin the people of Israel committed? Where would you see that today? What would be some of those things you would name? And after some discussion on that, another question: what are the means God is warning us today, in which He's making our nation and our churches aware we're sinning against the Lord? And there's just numerous things. We've never been more awash with the teachings of the gospel. There's the Bible, there's Christian bookstores, there's radio stations that are on 24 hours, more than one. There's Christian music stations, there's all kinds of things on the internet. There's your church, there's your Sunday school class. I mean, the list is long in which God speaks to us about His commandments and calls us to keep His commandments. The second point is rejected, chapter 17, verses 14 through 17. And here we're told how the people respond from the warnings from God's messengers. And so again, I would just read through the text and make an explanation. Just a few things here let me point out. Verse 14, but they would not listen. We've talked about this before, the word listen or the word hear. It's not that they didn't know these things. The Hebrew mindset was, if you say you heard God but you don't obey God, they would say, you must not have heard God. For what creature hears the great Creator and doesn't obey Him? So it's not that they're unknowing, it's that they're unwilling. And he says they became obstinate, and it's a picture of a draft animal, an ox or a donkey, and he refuses to submit to the farmer, and as a result of that, he's not of any use to the farmer. He said, you were like that. You were obstinate like their ancestors. And the reason for them being obstinate, the reason why they won't listen is, he says, who did not believe the Lord their God. The idea of believing means you rely upon God, and it's evident by the way you obey God. They simply didn't believe. And notice the Lord is all capitalized. The covenant God. They would not yield to Him. They would not rely upon Him. They would not obey Him. The fundamental issue as to why these people were living this way is they wouldn't believe God. Now notice he begins to list all of these things. It's just this long list. In fact, I counted 10 things. One commentator counted the 12 out of the same list. But the point I want you to see when I just read through it is the word and. In fact, let me just read a portion of it, and you'll see it. You can go through your quarterly and just underline the word and it's like this list that he's producing to bring conviction that they have sinned against God. Notice verse 15. They rejected his statutes and his covenant he had made with their ancestors and the warnings he had given them. They followed worthless idols and became worthless themselves. Now that's an interesting thing. Whatever you worship is what's going to be produced in your life. You cannot worship something and stand apart from it. It's going to have an impact. They worshipped false idols. It produced a lifestyle and a practice in their life that was vulgar and destructive instead of worshiping the one true God. And the point is he's just listing all these things that they, as proof that they didn't believe God. They rejected God. And imagine if you're standing before the Lord and he begins to list your sins. Can you imagine? It just seems like it would be an endless list of things, of acts of disobedience and rebellion against God. And then he comes to your teenage years. And can you imagine that list? And he goes through the decade of your teenage years. And then he comes to your young adult years. I mean, can you imagine what that was like? And here's what he's doing with these people. He's going through and he's making this list of sins against him. Evidence that they have rejected God. And there's just some things in here that are powerful that you can bring out in your lessons as well. And you can discover those things through your study of the text. Now on page 106, there's a question that I want to use to ask the class. And again, I'm going to ask them to turn to their personal study guide to see the question, because what I want is them to see how that personal study guide is valuable and important to use. And the question goes something like this. Remember these horrible sins were culturally accepted to Israel. What do you see as a parallel with culturally acceptable practices today? But in God's eyes, it's wicked. The question has some kind of a flavor of that. And of course, the things that will come to mind, of course, abortion, the awful killing of children. There is pornography. There's the whole range of sexual sins. I took my grandchildren to see the latest animated movie. It's about Superman's dog. And at the very beginning of the movie, they're telling, these other dogs are telling Superman's dog that Superman has a boyfriend, or a girlfriend rather, and the dog is going to be relegated to next in line, not Superman's best friend. And he doesn't believe it. So the dogs ask, well, when do you not sleep on the bed? And one of the things the dog says is when Lois Lane spends the night. I've got my grandchildren there. And here it is, a children's movie, and they just dismiss adultery, fornication. That's how prevalent sexual sin is in our day. And these things are evil. Those things are obvious. How about Christians who just occasionally attend church? Not because of work, or not because of travel, or not because of responsibilities with family, but sometimes they go to church and sometimes they don't go to church just simply because of the way of their own decision. Would that not be evil in God's eyes? How about biblically illiterate Christians? We got all of this Christian literature. We all have a copy of God's precious word, and yet we don't know the stories that we've been studying about in 1st and 2nd Kings. I want to close this lesson out, rejected by pitching a case study. Here's a man who has a wife and a girlfriend. He believes if he can keep both ignorant of the other, that he can be blissfully happy. And we know immediately that is stupid. And we also know immediately that never happens. But he drinks this Kool-Aid based on false assumptions. Tell me why his assumptions are wrong. and yet he would act that way. And it's so obvious it's wrong and it's stupid. And what I'm wanting to do in this is I'm wanting them to understand if the devil can make you believe false assumptions, he can destroy you. And so far in this lesson, we've seen some false assumptions that have destroyed Israel. One is this: God will not really hold me accountable. That's a false assumption, and it'll lead to destruction. Number two, no one will ever know about this. Yes, God will know about this. What's been whispered in the air be shouted from the housetop. Number three, this won't really matter. One sin is so attractive to us, we think we can get away with it. Sin is so attractive to us, we think we can get away with it. The next point says we won't. In the next point, it's removed. Verses 17 through 20. And I'm going to ask the class, listen for the Lord's response to the people's repeated rejections. And so I read the text, and then what was God's response? And there's twice that he says he's going to remove or banish them from his presence. And what he's talking about there is the promised land. The promised land was the stage on which God fulfilled his promises to the people of Israel. And the point of he's moving them out of that promised land. And his purposes will not be displayed as he intended. But the writer of 2 Kings is saying God is going to redeem his people, a remnant, and bring them back to the land. But it's the idea that they've resisted God, and as a result of that, he has brought judgment upon their lives by moving them out from under his protection. Divine punishment is not simply the result of bad choices. What the text is revealing to us is we have offended a holy God by our sin. And a holy God must punish sin. Yes, Assyria on the political field is a part of what's explaining the destruction of Israel. But they are the tool in the hand of a God who's exercising his wrath, his abiding opposition to sin. And there needs to be this clear message that God is active in his justice when it comes to disobedience and sin. I'm going to write 2 plus 2 on the board and ask them what's the answer to that. And then ask them, are you certain that's true? Is that always true, 2 plus 2? Now, in our day and time, it seems like they want to change that. 2 plus 2 is not always 4, but most people believe, straight thinking believe, that's a certainty. 2 plus 2 is 4. And we're certain of that enough that we put our money in the bank and let them count it for us, because we know they operate off of this certainty, 2 plus 2 is 4. This lesson is saying, just as certain as 2 plus 2 equals 4 is the fact that God holds all people accountable for their sins. To close the lesson, I found a prayer by Scotty Smith. The title of the prayer is a prayer for a gentle, kinder, more Christ-like heart. And I'll provide a link for you to go to it if you want. And I have copied off the prayer and put it on a single sheet of paper. And I'm going to give each member of my class a copy of this prayer. And then as we close the class, I'm going to read the text, Ezekiel 36, verse 25 to 27. And then I'm going to ask a person to assign each paragraph of this prayer to a person. And the way we're going to close the class is we're going to have one person read a paragraph, each paragraph for this prayer. And then I'm going to ask the class, would you take this prayer with you? And once a day, would you just simply read this prayer as your prayer to God? A prayer for a gentler, kinder, more Christ-like heart. This is what we need, because one day we will stand and give an account of our lives to God. Thank you for being a part of our Bible study, and thank you for teaching the Word of God.